Ethiopian 501, heavy turn right direct Reagan, across Reagan.
On the 23rd of November 1996, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961 was getting ready to depart Addis Ababa Airport in central Ethiopia. On board were a flight crew of 12, and amongst them were 163 passengers. As they climbed into the air, everything seemed to be going normally. But what they didn't know is that amongst the 163 passengers were 3 hijackers. Not a single person on board that day was going to reach their destination. And for some, this trip would be their last. After waiting for a connecting flight, Captain Lulabate would finally be given clearance to take off. Pushing the throttles forward on his Boeing 767, it responded like countless times before and pushed all 175 people on board down the runway and into the air, leaving Addis Ababa Airport at exactly 8:09 a.m. For the first 20 minutes after takeoff, the flight seemed to be going well, and I'm sure for all those on board, the biggest problem they thought they were going to have that day was the extreme boredom often associated with a long-haul flight. But boy, were they wrong. After finishing the initial climb out of Addis Ababa, 3 men would jump from their seats and storm the cockpit, intent on taking over the plane. They were even threatening to blow up the plane if everyone on board didn't follow their commands, with one of them even shouting while they approached the cockpit, "Everybody should be seated. I have a bomb." The bomb in his hand was nothing more than a bottle of whiskey, but no one on board knew that. At this point, it's easy to think that the captain in command that day, Latu Abate, would have been completely taken by surprise and had no idea how to handle a situation like this. But the funny thing was, this wasn't even the first time one of his planes had been hijacked. In fact, it wasn't even the second time. During the 70s, 80s, and even 90s, hijackings were somewhat common around the world. So much so that this period of time was given the not-so-great name of the Golden Age of plane hijackings. But even with so many, they would rarely end in fatalities. Most of the time, those hijacking mostly wanted to divert the plane to seek asylum or wanted some amount of money rather than doing it for some abstract ideological goal. Now, obviously, after 9/11, this all changed, but it's important to note that the mindset during this period of time wasn't immediate death. Either way, both previous times that Abate's planes had been hijacked had led to no fatalities. Long before Flight 961, sometime around April 1992, Abate would be flying a 727 from Addis Ababa Airport, intending to reach Bahir Dar just 1 hour away. This flight would turn into perhaps the longest flight of his career to date. 2 Ethiopian couples, both armed with hand grenades, would hijack the plane, demanding that it be refueled in Kenya before flying on to Toronto. Included in their demands was the request of $5 million to go alongside their alternate route. Luckily for all 105 passengers on board that day, after landing in Kenya, the plane wouldn't take off again. Instead, negotiations would take place for over 4 hours. The hijackers eventually surrendering themselves to authorities when they figured out that their hope of getting to Canada, never mind the $5 billion, just wasn't going to happen. The second went much like the first. This time he was flying a 737 on the exact same route, when his plane was hijacked by 5 Sudanese men, who wanted nothing more than to reach Libya. Luckily for all on board, they allowed the plane to land in Sudan in order to refuel it. There, the plan was changed. They instead wanted to go to Sweden, probably to claim asylum. However, with the plane on the ground, the Sudanese authorities just weren't going to let it take off again. Refusing to refuel it, the hijackers slowly ran out of time, while the hot and humid temperature outside caused everyone inside the plane to sweat and suffer. Eventually, the heat became too much to handle, even for the hijackers. Just like the first hijacking, they would surrender to authorities, and everyone would make it out unharmed. Once in the cockpit, the 3 men quickly found the fire axe. In the event of a fire that the crew couldn't reach, This would be used to rip at and remove parts of the plane so that they could get better access to the fire and hopefully be able to deal with it. But now in the hands of the hijackers, it had another purpose. They quickly grabbed it from behind the pilot's chair, while screaming constantly that they had a bomb on board and they were willing to use it. Proclaiming that there were 11 hijackers on board in total, they then used the fire axe to incapacitate the first officer. He was then dragged from the cockpit, leaving Captain Abate alone with the 3 men. Then, with a plane probably filled with terrified passengers and a bewildered flight crew, an announcement was made by the 3 men, in 3 different languages: French, English, and Amharic. They simply stated that they had control of the aircraft, their destination was altered, and they had a bomb on board, and they weren't afraid to use it. Hearing this over the plane's intercom, Abate quickly radioed the Addis Area Control Center, notifying them that his plane had been hijacked. But realizing that the captain was still speaking over the radio about what was happening on the plane, caused the 3 men in the cockpit with him to remove his microphone and forbid him from speaking to air traffic control any further. From this point on, the Boeing 767 would fall silent to air traffic control. Down on the ground, messages were being passed back and forth between Addis Control and Nairobi Control Center. They all assumed that Flight 961 would be making a diversion to Mombasa, but 39,000 feet above them, the 3 hijackers had different plans. After the initial attack to get the first officer out of the cockpit, the aims of the trio became quite clear. They demanded to be taken to Australia. Yes, that Australia. They had read that the maximum flight range of the 767 was 11 hours on the in-flight magazine, and thus delusionally thought that every plane had this range at all times. But unfortunately for them, and all on board, Flight 961 only had 2 hours fuel remaining. While Captain Abate and the hijackers were going back and forth, it became clear to him that they were all basically drunk as hell. He began to doubt at all whether or not they even cared about reaching Australia. The tapes recovered after the incident showed clearly the angst and desire for both Abate and air traffic control to get the men to agree to a refueling stop in Mombasa, stating, "I just wanted our hijackers to hear what you are communicating. If you have anything to say, go ahead and tell them." The control center would then go on to state, "I am advising you that with 2 hours fuel, you will be unable to reach your destination, and probably you will ditch in the ocean. The best solution is for you to land in Mombasa and pick up some more fuel." But these pleas would fall on deaf ears, whether out of fear of being tricked, a sense of delusion, or some sort of suicide pact. The 3 men weren't going to allow this plane to touch down safely. After passing Mombasa, the place where they should have been refueling, they continued southwards, heading instead towards Zanzibar, and then down the southeast coast of Africa. But something wasn't making sense to the 3 hijackers. If the captain was really following their commands, why could they still see the coast of Africa out of the right-hand side of the plane? Were they being tricked by Captain Abate? Well, while these thoughts were turning over in their heads, Captain Abate was desperately and silently calling the company radio to communicate the remaining fuel, heading and position. And just as he had managed to communicate these vital statistics, his headset was snatched from him for the second and final time. As time went on, it started to dawn more and more on the crew that the hijackers weren't interested in reaching Australia at all. They only seemed to be getting progressively drunker as the flight went on, sipping whiskey out of the brown bag the supposed bomb was in. It was clear that if Captain Abate kept flying directly east as directed by the hijackers, they would simply run out of fuel and have to ditch in the Indian Ocean. But cunningly, Abate had come up with one last attempt to save the, at this point, limping plane. He set a course for the Comoro Islands. They were halfway between the African mainland and Madagascar. If he could manage to keep control of the plane, and if there was just enough fuel left, he would maybe be able to guide the plane into a miraculous landing at Comoro's main airport, Moroni. While this was all happening, two of the hijackers went back into the cabin, while the leader, is unsure which one, sat in the first officer's seat. For the entirety of their remaining journey, would pull and push random controls, the rudder pedals, and even at one point trying to extend the reverse thrust while mid-flight. Something that would cause the plane to rip itself to pieces and fall out of the sky. Luckily, his attempts to end the flight early were thwarted, and all 175 people on board continued on their path to the Comoro Islands. While sipping whiskey and playing with the wings of the plane, the hijackers were seemingly unaware of the danger they were actually in. No matter how much Captain Abate seemed to plead with them, they just didn't seem to care about just how low the level of fuel in the plane was getting. Even when he would point to the low fuel gauges in the cockpit, they wouldn't even get a reaction from the man sitting in the first officer's chair. But whether they cared about the situation at hand or not, it would make no difference. At this point, the plane was going to run out of fuel, and the only outcomes left were try to land at Moroni Airport, or attempt a landing in water. Something that at this point in time had never been successfully done. Approaching the islands, Captain Abate was becoming more and more irate about the situation unfolding in front of him. He begged and pleaded with the hijackers to allow him to land. All the while, the red flash of the low fuel warning continued to repeat and fill the cockpit over and over again. The hijackers gave no concern to their or his situation at all, only repeating that the plane cannot descend below 39,000 feet, something that very soon was going to be out of the captain's control. Then, at 11:41 a.m, the noise in the plane seemed to dull, and an eerie half-silence seemed to take its place. The one thing that Captain Abate had feared had started to happen. The right engine had run out of fuel and was now just simply windmilling through the air. Instead of producing power to help the plane stay airborne, it was instead acting as a huge form of drag. The situation was becoming critical. Now, whether it was the engine spooling down and the associated noise, or just some happenstance or stroke of luck, at this exact moment, the lead hijacker, the only one in the cockpit with Captain Abate at this time, got up from his seat, left the cockpit, and went back into the cabin to speak with the other two hijackers. Abate, seeing a slim opportunity to act, did so. He quickly grabbed his microphone, the one discarded earlier by the hijackers, and used it to speak quickly to all those on board. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your pilot. We have run out of fuel, and we are losing one engine this time. And we are expecting crash landing, and that is all I have to say. We have lost already one engine, and I ask all passengers to react to the hijackers. But in the cabin, there was no reaction to the captain's speech, other than the hijackers instantly returning to the cockpit and knocking the microphone out of his hand. With the right engine now producing no lift, the slowing airspeed could cause the entire plane to stall and fall out of the sky. Seeing this possibility, and not caring about the hijackers' threats any longer, Abate, ignoring their instructions not to fly below 39,000 feet, made the plane descend to a safer altitude, and so it could increase its airspeed in order to prevent a stall. While this was all occurring, his new, idiotic first officer was interfering with the controls of the airplane throughout the entire maneuver. His stupid control inputs were also too much for the autopilot to manage, causing it to disconnect. This now meant Captain Abate was in an actual real-life fight just for control of the aircraft. Their airspeed would end up varying over 100 miles per hour, while both him and the hijacker fought for control of the aircraft. And just as Abate had managed to regain control, the left engine followed the same fate as the right. There was no more fuel left. At this point, the plane had become a glorified glider. With the plane almost completely silent, the hijacker left to go into the cabin once again, foolishly instructing Abate not to let the plane descend further. Seemingly unaware that the quiet that everybody on board could now hear was from having exactly zero thrust and zero ways of keeping the plane in the air. When he did return to the cockpit, Abate was in a state of almost acceptance. When angrily questioned about why he was allowing the plane to descend, even the threat of death didn't seem to bother the exasperated captain any longer. As he stated, "I am already dead because I am flying an aeroplane without engine power." While this was all happening, in the cabin behind the two men, First Officer Eunice Makuria, a man that had over 6,500 hours of flying time, had managed to regain his whereabouts and was informing passengers about how to get into the brace position. He already seemed to know what was about to happen. But in one last heroic attempt, after helping his passengers, he somehow managed to force his way back into the cockpit, fighting with the hijackers all the way back to his seat in order to help his overwhelmed captain. Without engine power though, all the controls on the aircraft would be incredibly heavy. Moving them would prove incredibly draining and difficult, even with both of them pulling on them. With both of them back at the controls though, they found themselves only having roughly 2 minutes left before they would be on the ground, one way or the other. Descending over the Indian Ocean, the two men desperately pulled at the controls, trying to regain some kind of power over the outcome of the flight. By this point, there was no more hope of making Moroni Airport. They were going to have to ditch in the ocean. And although ditching might seem like the worst possible outcome, it still had a standard procedure that needed to be followed. The gear should be up, and if the swell in the water is significant, then the plane should be positioned parallel to the waves. And this is exactly what both Pilot Abate and First Officer Eunice fought to do in the final seconds before they were finally going to be reunited with the ground, well, the water. For the remaining few seconds, there's no point trying to describe what those two heroes tried to do that day. Instead, by chance, someone on a beach nearby was recording the entire thing. So it'll be much easier just to show you what happened. The aircraft was destroyed by the collision with the ocean. On approach, the left wingtip would touch the water as both pilots tried to align the plane parallel to the waves. Then, they would straighten out and fly level for a very short period of time. When they did actually touch down, they unfortunately hit her underwater reef, which would cause the plane to basically flip and break into 4 different sections. Of the 175 people on board, 6 out of the 12 crew and 119 out of the 163 passengers on board would tragically lose their lives. In a cruel twist of fate, several of the passengers that had survived the initial impact would end up drowning as they had pre-inflated their life jackets before the ditching. The captain and the first officer would end up surviving the crash, both being awarded aviation awards as part of their incredible heroics and bravery that day. Captain Abate, in an interview after the incident, gave his own theory as to why those 3 men did what they did that day. The hijackers knew they wouldn't make it to Australia. They just wanted us to crash. The way they were talking, they didn't want to live. They wanted to die, and bring everyone on that plane with them that day. But fortunately, for many of the survivors, they were exceptional people doing everything they could to prevent them. May all those who died rest in peace. If you enjoyed this video, or my videos in general, subscribe. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one.